How's that? Yeah, So I'm not going to advocate for a specific theory or a specific paradigm today. I'm going to offer you a framework that you can use to compare theories and paradigms. Developing this framework will necessarily lead to a revolutionary question about the nature of the reality that we inhabit, and then to a way to answer that question experimentally in terms of what I would argue is the single most important experiment for the field. But getting to these goodies is going to have a bit of a cost. We're going to have to establish what I call the missing foundational infrastructure for the entire field of P-consciousness science. So to understand what I mean by a foundational infrastructure, let's take a look at the case of mathematical physics. So over about 500 years, we've gone from Galileo dropping cannonballs to the Webb Space Telescope and the Large Hadron Collider. And I'd argue that the essential foundational infrastructure underpinning that journey has been the development first of symbols like X and T, here for location and time, for these cannonballs dropping past a measuring tape and a stopwatch, and then the combination of these symbols in specific, relevant, and insightful forms, like dx by dt, which then catalyzes the insight that that mathematical entity is identical to physical velocity. So now when we get to the scientific problem of conscious experience, we see that we have a single field divided by the lack of a common symbolism. So for the brain green light tree, we typically write symbols like lambda green for a specific wavelength of light reflected from the tree to the brain. We can write A for a generic measure of brain activity. Here MB labels the conventional matter-energy brain, and ME the conventional matter-energy sensory environment that the brain finds itself in. So in summary, below the diagonal, we have a set of symbols for quantified numeric measures. But above the diagonal, we have words, like greenness, for specific qualitative components of experience. So the apparently impossible problem we're going to need to face is to bridge this divide between quantified symbols and qualitative words. But before we accomplish that impossibility, I just want to claim that the symbolism that we're going to develop, the central infrastructural innovations, are not going to be dependent either on a particular scale or ontology. Because when I draw this central schematic picture with the brain and the tree, it may look like I'm going classical, macroscopic, maybe even substance matter. But a little reflection, either as we go or afterwards, I hope will show you that, again, these central innovations will follow through if I were to use instead a quantum scale, a computationalist ontology, or any of a literally infinite number of other worldviews. So what are the infrastructural innovations that we need here? So the first one is what I call angle bracket symbolism. So this is for labeling specific aspects of conscious experience or collections of those specific aspects. So for example, angle brackets, lambda green here, labels the specific aspect of the conscious experience that's consequent to the incidence of lambda green on the retinae. And then angle brackets ME, there is a symbol for the collection of such components that make up the total conscious experience of the sensory environment. Now, it may not be immediately apparent how that has helped, right? But the key thing is that we definitely have two aspects to deal with here: qualia-valued information above the diagonal and numerically measured information below. And by instantiating a symbolism where lambda green appears, for example, on both sides, we've built a unified language right there. So, for example, partially linking what I would very loosely call cause and effect, the light incident on the retinae, and then the conscious experience. Now, once we have a unified language for both sides, we can start to investigate the relationships between the two using that language. Now, to say that there are two sides here, I would claim, is not the assertion of a philosophical dualism at this point, any more than it's philosophical dualism to say, the electron has these two properties of mass and charge. So in blue, we have the what I call information translation. So that's taking brain-encoded information and converting it into qualia-valued information, labeled by angle bracket symbols. And then the other way around, we have arguably the more subtle and profound relationship, whether qualia-valued information has an impact on standard physics measures of the brain. Now, I'll come back to information translation in a moment, but first I'm going to explain to you why I call that purple relationship dynamical innovation. So to do that, I'm going to construe the physical brain as a meter or measuring device or reporting device for conscious experience. Now, if that seems a little odd to you, just try this analogy. Replace the tree by a fire, the brain by a sort of speaking thermometer, and those words there by something like the temperature is 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So construing the brain in this way, we then use the standard technology of mathematical physics to analyze such a meter-measured system setup, which is the Hamiltonian formalism. This is simply a mathematical way of capturing the physical interactions that are going on here. So if some property Q of the meter is genuinely interacting with some property P, then there must appear in what's called the interaction Hamiltonian this function f linking P to Q. Now this is like super intuitive, bordering on the obvious, right? Because if a thermometer pointer is measuring the temperature of a system, it must couple with the average molecular kinetic energy of that system, and that's simply then captured in the mathematics of the interaction Hamiltonian. So, somewhat obviously, for the case then of a brain reporting on conscious experience, the interaction Hamiltonian has to take this form. It has to link angle bracket symbols for qualia-valued data with the symbol A, specifically the brain activity that's governing report, governing muscles that produce speech, for example, as is going on right now. So, this might seem like a very elaborate way of stating the bleeding obvious at this point, but in fact, that is not the case. So angle bracket symbols are a way of clarifying some of the scientific and philosophical confusions about identity and emergence in relationship to what I'm, again, going to loosely call the causal effect of conscious experience, for example, the ability for me to speak from my conscious experience right now. And this H-int expression is a key to understanding the hard problem, the meta problem, and the real problem, because if you can't write an H-int of this form, then all of those problems immediately become scientifically impossible methodological problems, because we can't speak about conscious experience, and it's a fact that the current physics underpins the mainstream neuroscience theories that we've seen earlier, denies the capacity to write this kind of interaction Hamiltonian. So to use a cooking analogy, the Hamiltonian is a bit like a curry, and the curry you can make depends on the spices you have, right? Well, the fundamental physics that's currently underpinning neuroscientific theory does not have the spices for this curry. So to understand that only a little bit more technically, the Hamiltonian is a high-level system description in mathematics, and it has to be congruent with the low-level physical laws of the context in which it's developed. So if this purple arrow, qualia-valued coupling to standard physics measures, is occurring, then there must be something new, novel, and innovation in fundamental physics, and that's why I call this, the purple aspect, dynamical innovation. Or to put it another way, we can only talk about phenomenal consciousness, we can only talk from our conscious experience in those realities where there's angle brackets coupling, qualia-valued information coupling to standard physics entities, and current physical law says we don't live in such a reality. So this idea that I'm developing here that in order to have a non-contradictory, experimentally grounded science of consciousness, science of conscious experience, we need new physics, is converted in what I call the meta-Hamiltonian argument into a theorem in mathematical physics. I haven't proven that theorem here, but if you're interested in it, you can find it in the preprint there. And in more accessible forms, that's a very succinct and dense presentation in the citations and references. So I began with the idea that the 500 years since Galileo depended on symbols and ways of connecting symbols. So for conscious experiential science, the symbol that we've been missing, the symbol class, is this angle bracket class. And the connection of those symbols to mainstream physics that we've needed primarily is via these kind of Hamiltonians. Okay, so now we've established the foundational missing infrastructure, I can begin the presentation on comparing theories of consciousness at last. Thanks for bearing with that. So there's roughly two ways to compare theories. First on theoretical conceptual grounds, and then secondly using experimental data. So the conceptual framework I'll develop simply going to use those two relationships that I mentioned, dynamical innovation vertically and information translation horizontally, to develop these four quadrants and then put the various theories in the quadrants according to their capacity to handle these different aspects. Now, when we end up with more than one theory in the top right-hand corner, minimally complete and scientific, what we would usually do in science is then go for an experimental program to get data to arbitrate between them. But as I'll come to, in phenomenal consciousness science, things are more subtle than that. Because before we get to conventional experimental programs, we're going to need to ask and answer this revolutionary question that I'm going to come on to next after we just go through the application of the theoretical comparison. So firstly, comparing prominent theories on their capacity to enact dynamical innovation. The key issue here is whether subjects in experiments are really talking about phenomenal consciousness. And if they're not, then there aren't any experiments, so there isn't any science. Okay? So the Meta-Hamiltonian theorem suggests that for there to be phenomenal report, we need new physics. Now, if we take the group of theories that I'm very loosely, again here, calling non-reductive physicalism in the red box there, that includes IIT and global neuronal workspace theory and things like that. These guys intentionally situate themselves within a physics that lacks and denies qualia-valued coupling. So the first pass around that is that these theories, although they're being experimentally tested, their contextual milieu denies the capacity for there to be experimental tests. Now, there are very smart people involved in this, right? So some people are aware of this, and what they've tried to do is add these psychophysical bridging principles that basically say, they have to basically say, no, we do have report, right? But what's happened there is that you've just thrust on top of standard physics a contradiction to standard physics. So then the entire analytical framework that's being used here has a contradiction built into it. And that's why it will go round and round and round forever until people run out of money. Okay, moving up, onwards and upwards. So Orch-OR versions 1 and 2. So 1 is the 1989 original articulation, and then I chose the 2014 later expression. In my reading, version 1 definitely proposes a dynamical innovation, but primarily that innovation is high-level non-algorithmic brain computation. It doesn't explicitly address, in my read, phenomenal consciousness or the coupling of qualia-valued data. The later iteration, the 2014, can definitely be read as an explicit theory of phenomenal consciousness, which gives it that P superscript there, Orch-OR P, and as a means of enacting qualia-valued coupling with standard brain physics. So you get a P+, so Orch-OR 2 can definitely be read as a scientific theory of phenomenal consciousness. Okay, moving on to information translation. Again, that's the movement from the brain encoding of the environment to qualia-valued experience. So here we have two boxes, the red box and the green box. So the red box, I put theories which just has a very general explanation of how and why information translation is occurring. So for example, it's occurring because information integration is occurring in this system. In the green box, I'd put theories that go to another level of detail. Let me explain what that is. So first, recognizing that in principle we have two different coordinate systems for the brain and conscious experience. I think this might get to something that Ricardo was trying to get at on Friday, for those of you who saw his talk. What we would really want for a detailed theory is a list of explicit relationships between brain activity at two brain locations, R1 and R2, and then a specific correspondent qualia-valued angle brackets ME1 at row 1. Now, these kinds of relationships are clearly related to a yet-to-be-articulated complete theory of neural encoding, but they're absolutely not identical to it. And I think like a failure to make this distinction is one reason why when we go to the prominent theories, there's actually no theory that falls in the green box. I put them all in the red. So when we go to the two-dimensional analytical structure, the only thing that differentiates prominent theories then is the dynamical innovation content of theories. Now, leaving that top right green quadrant empty is a little bit unsatisfactory. So very briefly, let's look at how we could fill it in principle. So here's something called N theory. I'm not going to go over in any detail. You can look at the preprint there if you're interested in it. But the key point that I want to bring out, this theory proposes that there's this kind of exotic matter bridge between brain locations and locations in conscious experience. And this can be an explicitly unfolded material structure for taking, integrating, and moving information from the brain to conscious experience in order to enact that translation. So once we kind of have a gut sense of what information translation might look like in that physical way, it's possible to extend other theories to make them minimally informationally complete. But typically, as this preprint explains, what we have to do right now is add long lists of A to angle brackets relationships to fundamental physical law in order to recapitulate that physical translation that we saw in N theory. Okay, so now we've got three theories. I should say it's possible to torture non-reductive physicalism up into the top right, but I'm not going to talk about how to do that right now. Once we've got more than one theory in the top right, we would typically go for experimental programs that can arbitrate between them. But here, in P-consciousness science, we need to do something else. First, we need to ask and answer this revolutionary question. So let's get on to that. So a primary thesis here is that the ability to talk about conscious experience depends upon qualia-valued coupling to standard physics brain measures. Now, pretty much everybody seems to believe that when I talk about the redness of those words up there, it's actually that redness that is causally participating in my speech act, right? Now, that belief is actually a belief that we do live in an angle brackets coupled reality. Okay. But we could be wrong about that belief, just as humankind was collectively wrong about the sun going around the earth. And if you find it really hard to believe that you could be wrong about speech acts, about your conscious experience, you could try reading Dan Dennett's controversial and provocative work. But the point is, because that subjective belief could be wrong, what we would really like to do in science is answer it experimentally rather than adopt a belief. So this, asking the question, does angle brackets coupling, does qualia-valued coupling to standard physics measures exist in our reality? This is the revolutionary question, and if we're going to answer it scientifically, we want to do it by an experiment. Now, properly speaking, this asking and answering should happen before we try and arbitrate between top-right theories, because an affirmative answer to the existence actually establishes that the top-right exists. But then, P-consciousness science would carry on, but necessarily with a revision in the structure of fundamental physical theory. Going the other way, if the experiment shows that there isn't such coupling, then we have no science of P-consciousness. We have to revise our subjective beliefs about subjective experience, and this is why, one of the reasons why I think this is the most important experiment, because either way, we get radical insight. But over and above that, it's necessary to found the whole field on a solid experimental basis. So what is the character of this experiment? Well, very briefly, you take actual brain data, and then you make a standard physics detailed computer simulation, And if there's non-trivial coupling between qualia-valued information and standard physics measures, you'd expect to see a deviation between actual and simulated data. Now, that's very demanding, obviously, but I would argue probably of the same order as the experiments that Hartmut was talking about on Saturday. So once we founded the field on positive results from that experiment, if we do, then a simplified experimental program like this, testing between the top right theories, would kick off from there. So what are the takeaways? Well, first are these specific comparisons between IIT and friends, Orch-OR and N-theory. Then there's the general comparative framework, the 2 axes and 4 boxes. If there's one thing I'd love people to take away, it's thinking about the significance of this angle brackets coupling, qualia-valued information coupling to standard physics measures. But what does it all have to do with Stewart's call for a revolution and the role of quantum theory? Okay, so in the bottom left red quadrant are 21 of the 22 theories that Paavo spoke about on Friday. So if the mainstream isn't aware that there's a crisis, well, that hurricane's going to come at some point. If you go to the top right, certainly because there is an Orch-OR version in there, Orch-OR is, a leading candidate for the revolution. But I would say that beyond that, if we want to have this 500-year Galilean kind of scale of movement that Thomas spoke about on the first day, we need to ground the top right through these experiments that probe the existence of angle bracket coupling in our reality. So now Stewart spoke yesterday about the possibility that consciousness exists before life and even brings it into being. There are those of us that believe that consciousness exists before matter, which exists before life, and that consciousness will go on even after the end of matter. So now if we want to go take science up to those exalted heights of looking into that in a scientific way, I suggest we need a really solid, perhaps a more solid platform than I've had for this speech. And I'll leave you with the thought that angle bracket symbolism, the meter-Hamiltonian coupling, and the experimental probe of qualia-valued information in our reality would be the underpinning for such a platform for the next 500 years.
Thank you so much. It was very quick. How about time for a quick question? There's one back there.
Thanks very much, and I think this introduction of formalism is a great idea. And in fact, I'm quite interested in your angle brackets operators. I'm a vision scientist, and so I'm always anxious to avoid what I call visual chauvinism. We in consciousness, we are seeing people are, I think, prejudiced in our looking at consciousness as a visual phenomenon, and of course it's not. It involves many, many other things like memory and imagination, as well as all of our other sensory modalities. So my question for you is, could your angle operators actually enhance your experimental process? In other words, instead of taking the elaborate complexity of vision and maybe looking at other operators in consciousness, what that take you to some of the experimental questions that you want?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is 10 years work in about 20 minutes, so I had to drop all of that stuff out. But so as a general response, so that angle bracket formalism generalizes very quickly and easily to other external sensory modalities. So hearing is the obvious, easy one too. This vision is just the easiest to display visually. And yes, other modalities are less complex. Other organisms also may be less complex for some of the experimental approaches. So in summary, the formalism generalizes to all external sensory modalities by putting in angle brackets around the stimulus, and then also inwardly, that's much harder. That's actually where there's a real challenge for the emotional kind of angle bracket stuff and proprioception and so forth. But yeah, thank you for the question. One more?
First, thanks for the talk. I'm saying you can have cases where you don't have coupling. Let's say dual aspect theories. You don't have coupling, but you have almost like two parallel movies that evolve in parallel without one affecting the other, and it's a legitimate theory. So it also, I don't know if Chalmers in his paper about the meta problem of consciousness, he talks about one solution to the meta problem that he calls meta-correlational. And the meta-correlational is exactly these cases where, now there are some arguments against such parallel theories, but there are theories without coupling.
Okay, so you may be showing a deficit in my presentation because what I'm receiving that I've created, the understanding that I've created in you is not what I intend to broadcast. So the angle brackets, that picture with the tree and then the brain and the line drawing and so on, that is not meant to be a psychophysical parallelism or even a dual aspect theory. It's simply meant to state what I take to be, before philosophers get involved, the scientific structure of the problem. If I had a mission here, it would be to rescue the science of consciousness from being haunted by the ghost of philosophy. Right? So when I've drawn that, then I'm asking I'm not stating that this is the answer. I'm asking a question: is there coupling that way? And I'm trying to convert that into an experiment, because I think what's happened is physical closure of the causal closure of the physical has taken on a life of its own. It's become unquestioned, and then these bridging principles have been put on top of it, and the whole thing is just a contradictory nightmare. So that's what I'm trying to unpick here. But thank you for your question.
Moving on.